Okay, good afternoon, sports fans and human factors fans. I hope you're all staying safe, and I'm going to try a new and improved method of teaching this class. I've gone through and completed the outline, and now I'll go through and talk about it. All right, so starting here at structural similarity, I'll scroll that up to the top. All right, so structural similarity means that the structure of the tasks is similar. So our different structures in human information processing behave as if they're supported by different resources. And that is the theory that we're going with here. So, to whatever extent our tasks are demanding different resources, the time sharing within the task, our multitasking, is improved. So, looking at table 6.1, we have four dimensions for multiple resources. And let me just annotate that. That is on page 152. All right, so we have the dimension of more modalities, right? So you have auditory and visual modalities. So auditory, that could be a synthesized voice display or alarm, different tones, etc. Visual is going to be like print or display on your computer screen. Then we have codes, and that's going to be spatial codes versus verbal codes. So tracking things, hand pointing, mental rotation, imaging, right? In other words, using our visuospatial scratch pad, or listening to speech, rehearsing, such as when you're memorizing a telephone number or speaking. All right, so our stages are perceptual, working memory versus response. So that might be searching, imaging, reading, rehearsing, listening versus pushing, speaking, pointing, manipulating. And then our visual channels are going to be focal versus ambient. So in other words, reading or interpreting symbols, or processing flow fields, or visual perception to maintain our balance. All right, so we consider that these dimensions are partially independent, or they're orthogonal. I already talked about the idea of being orthogonal in this class, but to remind you, that means that we have ways of distinguishing between controls or other things in human factors. So, if our tasks that we're doing in our multitasking format are demanding that that they use common levels of our resources, or our dimensions in this case, the time sharing is going to be worse. For example, in driving or aviation, auditory cues are preferred because the visual aspect is being used and using up a lot of your working memory at the time. All right, so we, at times, if we're going to have a time-sharing task, we want to alter the information display if we're going to change the resource demand. Okay, well, confusion, similarity between items in your working memory can just lead to confusion. That's obvious. So we want to eliminate that as much as possible. And one of the examples they give in the book is trying to monitor basketball scores while doing mental arithmetic, right? That means that you're probably going to get those two confused. All right, so let us begin talking about task management and interruption. We're going to have confusion when there's total interference between two ongoing tasks. In fact, maybe even without total interference, we'll have that kind of confusion. When we're talking about dual task performance, then we want to be in a situation where our primary task is getting the highest priority, and it should be buffered from high demand or structural similarity. When we are doing a dual task of this nature, the secondary task is necessarily degraded. Our decision about which is the primary and which is the secondary tasks is our task management. So, in that, we're going to have allocation of resources to one task or another. If we're going to have a successful time-sharing strategy, that is going to allow an optimal switching between our tasks. Now, switching between tasks can be good if parallel processing is impossible, right? So in that case, we would be talking about that kind of structural similarity, or both tasks need to use the same resources. If we have if we can rapidly alternate between the tasks, then the argument is that is concurrent processing. But slow switching between tasks leads to cognitive tunneling, where we may be giving one task a lot of attention and the other we're not giving it very much at all. Alarms are specifically used to redirect our users' attention. And what do you want to do there? All right, carry on with that. All right. So let's address what do we do when there's a time-sharing overload. Our guidelines are, first of all, redesign the task. If we can get out of using the same resources and redesign the task to make them less resource demanding, then we're going to improve the cognition about that task. Interface redesign, we can replace voice input, we can use voice input to replace text messages so that we are using things on two different channels. We're using the visual channel for one thing, and then we're supplementing that with the auditory channel. Training is something that I've emphasized over and over again as being something that we need to emphasize for human factors tasks. Training can be in repeated and consistent practice, just practicing our skills over and over again. Or it could be training in attention management skills. Right? Sometimes it is necessary to be able to ignore the noise around you in order to do your task. Now, another way that we can work on our task redesign is using automation. If we can use automation, replacing or simplifying our resource-demanding aspects of performance, that is obviously going to make it much easier, right? So, hence the use of supplementary systems in the computer software, quite likely, or in some other way to replace part of the decision making, right, where the software may pop up, hey, you might want to do this. Oh, I'm already into the next point. All right, so intelligent automation can be a task manager. It can drive your selective attention, maybe by animating something that you need to pay attention to, flashing light or flashing text, or even assume responsibility for the performance. All right, so that's it for Chapter 6, Cognition. Are there any questions? Okay, obviously I'm asking, are there any questions for a lecture that I'm giving you on video? But look, feel free to send me an email or give me a call if there's something that you're not quite understanding or you need to you need to know more about. Another thing that I would recommend is read your book. all these things I'm telling you are brought out of your book, but not in the depth they can go to in the book. All right, well, fantastic. All right, so as I said, that's it for chapter 6. And now on to chapter 7, decision making. Well, first we're going to define decision making. For one thing, we're going to select one option from several alternatives. We have some amount of information available, and our time frame is relatively long. Okay, they define long as more than a second. So you better think quick in their situation. That decision is going to be made in a framework where there is some uncertainty about what is the best course to pursue, right? So if any one of these is missing, if there's only one alternative, if there's no information available, if the time frame is super short, or if there's no uncertainty, then decision making becomes moot. All right, so we have 3 phases of decision making. The first, of course, is acquiring and perceiving information, right? So this is very similar to what we talked about when we were talking about selective attention. The second part is generating and selecting hypotheses or situation assessments. Okay, so we perceive the information, we acquire the information in some way. We're going to generate and select some assessment of our situation, and then planning and selecting a choice, right? This is about decision making, so we're going to have to make a choice as to our course of action. All right, so of course, as I've emphasized so often before, these human factors psychologists love to think in terms of models. In this case, decision-making models. One thing that we're going to do is we're going to specify the value, whether it's a cost or a benefit, associated with choices. We consider that the optimal choice maximizes the benefit or minimizes the cost. All right, well, the first thing we have in that regard is what are called normative decision models. In other words, they are rational models of how we should make a decision. They should specify what ideally should be done, and normative models are all about utility. In other words, maximizing the benefit or minimizing the cost. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is the multi-attribute utility theory. That is often expressed in the formula U of V is equal to the summation from I equals 1 to N of AI times UI. All right, so U of V is the overall utility of an option. where AI is the magnitude, oh dear, of the option on its ith attribute. UI is the utility of the ith attribute, and n is the number of attributes. Now you may be saying to yourself, what the hell is this bald guy on about? But this is something that we have discussed in other contexts. For example, in project management, we talk about making a decision matrix, or if you haven't done project management, we also talked about it in Intro to Engineering. All right, so here is table 7.1, okay, where we have different options, in this case, different cars that they're choosing from, and what are the attributes of each one that are desired. Okay, so you'll notice this says it's a Honda Accord for a 03, and we have the amount of utility for each attribute, and the attributes are things like sound system quality, maintenance costs, and how big that attribute is for each of the given choices. Oh, pardon me. Have to put it down. Okay, well, that is definitely a way of choosing, and it's a very rational method. It's not just, I feel like I should do such and such. It is similar, if you think about it, to the way we make decisions in engineering economy. Only there, we add up the cost or benefit of everything, and then we decide on a certain method or a certain machine or a certain process to do something based on how much money it will cost or how much money it will make. Okay, well, now one possible flaw, multi-attribute utility theory assumes that outcomes are certain. And of course, we know in life, outcomes are not necessarily certain. All right. The next theory that we're going to look at is expected value theory. And expected value theory replaces utility with expected value. Okay, so in statistics class, we talk about expected value. And I went over our expected value theory there, talking about winning the lottery, right? That when you can add up all your chances and they come out to be equal to the money that you are gambling, then you're in a situation where you are where it's worth the risk. All right, so we're replacing utility with the expected value. every choice has one or more outcomes. Okay, so for example, if we were talking about the lottery, we would be looking at, I'm playing Powerball. That means I can win if I match 3 numbers, or if I match 4 numbers, if I match 5, or if I match all the numbers. Right? So our expected value is the summation from I to n of the probability of the ith iteration with the value of the ith iteration. All right. So again, that's where EV is expected value, PI is the probability of the ith outcome, and VI is the value of the ith outcome. Okay, so that is expected value theory. As I said, we discussed this a little bit, at least, in our statistics class. And, well, I'm not sure what else to tell you, except that they give you an example in the book starting on page 159. After that, we have subjective expected utility theory. So that means that it's very similar to utility theory, but the worth component of every individual outcome is subjective for every person. All right, so on page 160, we have a table, hypothetical values in a subjective expected utility model for 2 possible states. All right, and they go through and do the math on that. I'm hoping you've got your book there and you're opening it to that, because unfortunately I seem to have injured my left arm and I can't hold the book up very well. All right, I'll give it a shot. All right, so there you see they go through the problem that from the beginning of the chapter that I didn't read in this iteration of class about anesthesiologists. Let me go back and read that for a moment. An anesthesiology team in a large hospital consists of 4 physicians, 3 of whom are residents in training. The group is asked to assist with 4 procedures in one building: an in vitro fertilization, a perforated viscus, reconstruction of a leg artery, and an appendectomy, and an exploratory laparotomy in another building. All procedures are urgent and cannot be delayed for the regular operating room scheduling. There are several delays in preoperative preparation, and several surgeons and nurses were pressuring the team to get the procedures finished. The situation was complicated by the fact that the resources to overlap procedure complicated by the fact that staff was only able to run 2 operating rooms simultaneously, and the best use of resources was to overlap procedures so that one case was started as another was finishing. An anesthesiologist in charge had to decide how to allocate the 4 members of the anesthesiology team to the 5 needed procedures. Also, there was always the possibility that an emergency case could come in to the hospital's trauma center, in which case the anesthesiologist in charge was expected to be immediately available. Should she allocate only the other 3 anesthesiologists to the 5 procedures, or should she help out also, leaving no one available should a major emergency come in unexpectedly? All right, so decisions of life and death at the hospital. All right, so back to the table. All right, so the choices are use 3 anesthesiologists or use 4 anesthesiologists, assume no emergency or emergency, and then total up what the expected outcomes are. All right, so what did they do? Well, of course, we're not told. For that matter, the whole thing is a setup where we can't necessarily even know because it's totally fictional. All right, well, enough about that. All right, so those are the naturalistic, the multi-attribute normative decision models. Now we move on to the descriptive decision models. This is decision making where we rely on simpler or less complete means of choosing. That means that we're often using heuristics, and that's not the correct spelling of heuristics. There you go. Heuristics are simplified shortcuts or rules of thumb. For example, one heuristic that I've used in industrial engineering is that if you double the size of the wheels on something, it halves the effort of moving it. All right, so the first we're going to talk about is satisficing. Satisficing means that when we get to a choice that's good enough, we stop. Right? The decision maker considers the choices until they find an acceptable one. All right. And when we find that acceptable one, going beyond that as far as looking at choices has no real advantage for the extra effort in going through the choices. So we say good enough for the government job, and we stop there. All right. Our next is naturalistic decision making. Naturalistic decision making Well, for example, let's look at table 7.2, which is on page 162. All right, so what are the characteristics of these naturalistic decision-making situations? Well, one is that it's a very ill-structured problem. Right? And the example they give is that there's no single one best way of fighting a forest fire. Right? That has to be with the used in conjunction with what things look like. Another characteristic is uncertain dynamic environments. So the forest fire, they're still using that example, is always changing. It means that there's constantly new decisions and new considerations. Another characteristic is that it's an information-rich environment where situational clues may be changing very rapidly. Okay, so in the fire, the smoke and flames, they can be seen, they can be heard, felt, but they're constantly changing. Another characteristic, cognitive processing that proceeds in interactive action / feedback loops. All right, so in other words, we are taking actions, we're seeing what effect they have, and we may change our actions then based on what is the effect of our actions. Multiple shifting and or competing individual and organizational goals. All right, so we want to be sure that we are keeping up with what the goals of the individual situations as they evolve require. Time constraints or time stress. The decisions have to be made quickly because there's not a lot of time. They're a characteristic of high risk. There can be really bad consequences for making the wrong decisions. And multiple persons are involved in the decision. There are going to be people contributing information and they're going to give perspectives on the decisions. All right, so that brings us to heuristics and biases. Obviously, there are information processing limits in our decision making, right? Part of that is going to be cue reception and integration. Well, they have to be received and integrated. All right, so when we get clues, they have to be selectively attended. We have to pay attention to what those cues are. They have to be interpreted, and they have to be integrated with each other. Okay, what does this cue mean when I put it with this cue as far as what's happening? The problem is the cues may be incomplete, they may be erroneous, they may be fuzzy. We may be getting cues that only tell us part of the story. they have nothing to do with the situation, or it's a cue we never got before, or we're not sure if it's related. So that is the first part. Then we have to do hypothesis generation and selection. So our cues are giving us educated guesses, diagnoses, or inferences, right? So we're trying to take those cues in and form our hypotheses based on that. Okay, pardon me for 1 second.